Imagine holding a fish's tooth older than our own species, and somewhere else entirely, a strand of ancient DNA that shouldn't exist yet, at least not according to the textbooks. One sits buried in the mud of a lakeshore in northern Israel, untouched for the better part of 1,000,000 years. The other sits inside a genome sequenced only months ago, on the other side of the world. Neither one means much on its own. Together they just rewrote when the human body actually started adapting to eat the way we do now. Everyone got this completely wrong. For decades, scientists searching for the moment humans first learned to cook went looking for a fire, ash, charcoal, a hearth blackened by flame. The real answer was hiding somewhere far stranger, inside a fish's teeth. At the site of Gesher Benot Yaakov, on the shore of Israel's ancient Hula Paleo Lake, archaeologist Irit Zohar of Tel Aviv University's Steinhardt Museum of Natural History and her team recovered more than 40,000 fish remains from hearth-associated layers dating back roughly 780,000 years. The bones themselves were mostly gone, dissolved by time. What survived were the pharyngeal teeth, the small grinding teeth carp use in their throats, thousands of them clustered suspiciously close to what the team identified as ancient hearths, in a pattern too consistent to be random. So Zohar's team ran the teeth through X-ray diffraction, and the result came back stranger than expected, exposed to controlled heat under 500 degrees Celsius. Not the scorching, erratic burn of a wildfire, not garbage tossed near a flame, something steadier, something deliberate. Published in Nature Ecology and Evolution in 2022, it became the oldest widely accepted direct evidence that hominins deliberately cooked a meal, pushing the record back by about 610,000 years. That felt like an ending. It was actually a beginning. If hominins were cooking fish nearly 800,000 years ago, when did the human body actually start adapting to a cooked, starch-heavy diet? For a long time, the story looked simple. Agriculture arrived roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. Starch became a much larger part of many human diets, and it seemed obvious our bodies evolved to handle it afterward, in response. At the center of that story sat one gene, AMY1, which produces salivary amylase, the enzyme that starts breaking starch down the moment food hits your mouth. Populations with starch-heavy diets tended to carry more copies of it, and for years that was read as recent farming-driven evolution. Before the genetics caught up to that assumption, one scientist had already argued the timeline felt too short. Harvard anthropologist Richard Wrangham proposed in his book Catching Fire that cooking works like external digestion, softening meat, breaking down starch, and cutting the energy cost of chewing, freeing up calories the body could spend elsewhere, on a bigger brain instead of a bigger gut. He pointed to Homo erectus, which appeared roughly 1.9 million years ago, with smaller teeth, a smaller gut, and a notably larger brain than its predecessors, changes that fit a diet demanding less chewing, but delivering more energy. Critics noted the anatomical shift predates the strongest direct cooking evidence by over 1,000,000 years, a gap nobody has fully closed, and for years that gap was the whole argument against him. But Wrangham's idea planted something important anyway. Maybe the human body had been preparing for a cooked, energy-dense diet long before anyone thought to look for proof in the genome itself. That proof arrived in November of 2024. Geneticist Omer Gakuman's lab at the University at Buffalo, working with Charles Lee's lab at the Jackson Laboratory, did something nobody had managed before. They resolved the individual copies of that same starch gene at sequence-level precision nobody had reached before. Traditional short-read sequencing had always failed here, unable to tell nearly identical gene copies apart, like trying to count identical twins standing shoulder to shoulder in a crowd photo. Long-read sequencing finally solved that, and the team didn't stop at modern humans. They compared the region across ancient genomes and archaic hominins, including Neanderthals, reaching back further into the genome than anyone studying this gene had ever gone. What they found upended the farming story completely. A common 3-copy version of the gene had already appeared roughly 800,000 years ago, and that same ancient duplication turned up in Neanderthal genomes too, meaning it existed before modern humans, and Neanderthals even split from their shared ancestor. Pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers, including a 45,000-year-old genome recovered from Siberia, already carried an average of 4 to 8 copies, long before anyone planted a crop or ground a single grain of wheat. The foundation for efficient starch digestion wasn't built by farming. It had been sitting there for hundreds of thousands of years before the first field was ever planted. Two clues nobody thought to connect, until now. The gene duplication, roughly 800,000 years old. The cooked fish at Gesher Beno Yaakov, roughly 780,000 years old. Two completely different methods, on two completely different continents, run by teams that had likely never read each other's papers, landing within 20,000 years of each other. That doesn't prove one caused the other. But it does mean that right around the time hominins were leaving behind the earliest convincing evidence of a deliberately cooked meal, their genomes were already carrying an adaptation that made starch easier to digest. One story buried in lakeshore mud, the other buried in a strand of DNA. For decades, those two stories weren't even in the same conversation. Now they're circling the same chapter. And Wrangham's decades-old hypothesis suddenly looks less like a guess and more like an early sketch of something real. More gene copies generally means more salivary amylase, giving the body a head start on starch before it even reaches the stomach. Cooking amplifies that advantage. Heat softens plant tissue and gelatinizes starch, handing the enzyme an easier job and the body more usable calories from the same meal, for less digestive effort spent extracting them. The Buffalo and Jackson laboratory team is careful not to claim this proves widespread cooking 800,000 years ago. What it shows is stranger. Evolution was already favoring efficient starch digestion long before agriculture existed, as if the body were quietly preparing for a lifestyle that hadn't arrived yet, packing for a trip nobody had announced. None of this proves hominins were baking bread 800,000 years ago. The starch gene also helps digest raw plants, so extra copies alone aren't proof of cooking, and ancient fire itself is its own puzzle. Warmth, protection, or a meal, the ash rarely says which. Most researchers now think no single breakthrough explains the shift. Stone tools reduced chewing, fire opened new possibilities. And cooking eventually unlocked calories nothing else could reach. Each innovation layered quietly on top of the last across an almost unimaginable stretch of time. Maybe that's the real surprise sitting in a fish's tooth and a stretch of ancient DNA. Cooking wasn't a clever trick invented after civilization got underway. It may have been written into human biology long before the first farm, the first city, or the first word was ever spoken. And it never stopped running. The next time you take a bite of bread or rice or anything starchy at all, your own saliva starts breaking it down before you've even swallowed, using instructions passed down from ancestors who had already begun adapting to a cooked, starch-rich world on the shore of a lake that no longer exists, 800,000 years ago, long before that lake even had a name.